Hey, so Love of Ruins, thank you for joining today to discuss your compilation contribution to the Tymbal compilation made strictly from cicada samples. I want to thank you for joining us. And as an intro question, could you talk about sort of your general approach to music and sort of your background in it, how you got to where you are now, taking cicada sex noises and making them into into techno?
Right, right. Well, I mean, it all started back when I was a little kid, and like I was banging on pots and pans in the like kitchen, and parents were like getting annoyed by that, so they bought me a drum set. And my first instruments were then, basically percussion. Getting into rhythm and not really thinking about music in terms of like timbre and structure, but more, yeah, just rhythm patterns and like sounds that I liked. And I actually kept the pots and pans in my kit, like putting them, in the like drum racks and stuff, and growing up, like I got exposed to a lot of experimental and industrial music stuff as a kid, and one of the first things that like I figured out how to do was like make tape loops with simple tape recorders, and then eventually with 4-track recorders and that kind of thing. Um, I was really interested in combining rhythm and noise, not so much, you know, regular musical structures, but like how polyrhythms like overlap, and like, how you can just build like atmospheres with found or like, field recorded sounds, that kind of thing. Um, I That's like goes back all the way to, yeah, teenage years, early teenage years. Um, I got my first sampler when I was like 16. It was like a birthday present. I got one of those like EPS 16 plus, performance sampler 88 key thing. And I just dove into that thing and like started understanding how to digitally manipulate samples pretty early on. Yeah, that was like in the 80s. As like industrial was going from more like Einstein Zetna Neubauten, like kind of like experimental banging on pots and pans and drills and all kinds of found instruments, to more stuff that was like taking that and putting it in a box and like chopping it up and looping it and like sequencing it and giving it structure. Um, yeah, it was a pretty quick evolution from basically taking long tape loops, across the room, and doing all kinds of weird things with, expanding those and actually making tape echoes and that kind of thing manually. Lots of pieces of tape to like put it all together. To, oh, I've got this amazing like thing that can hold like 8 tracks of like a sample on every key, and like, I can do amazing things with all in this one keyboard and play them on the keyboard. It's like it was like the mothership was given to me like at 16. And all my music from then like just evolved into more, electronic based stuff, but like with the sources being whether they were found like break beats, or me banging on like, things around me that I found, as well as like textural just noises of, birds and bees and water and whatever else, and trying to manipulate it into something else. Um, I was, like I said, influenced by a lot of industrial stuff. And then eventually, late 80s, early 90s, getting into techno and stuff like that. Um, I spent most of the 90s doing dance music, more or less, but, not always in the same style. Like I became very eclectic with it, because I was like, I've got this machine that can do any style of music I want if I, just, it's like an open palette, like, and all the tools are there. Mid 90s kind of got into, the first like computer based stuff with like Cubase and whatnot, and like had a whole bunch of hardware on top of the EPS, which I actually still have the EPS, but these days, like if I jump forward, um, yeah, I do a lot of stuff with, Octatracks, Electron boxes, Eurorack. We got a big collection of synthesizers and drum machines and that kind of thing. And yeah, I've just never limited myself to like any like sort of genre or sound palette for the most part in my music. I've been extremely like just let myself like explore anything and see what comes out of it without limits. Sometimes it's maximal, sometimes it's minimal. Um, I guess probably 93 or 4 after like years of like doing like little collaborations in my hometown, Richmond, Virginia, with like fellow like industrial techno heads, like putting out like little cassettes of Somatron. I think was the first thing that I put out with Rob Guest from Malakota and Slang Louse fame back in that day. To the next thing I did was I was on Thievery Corporation's label,
Oh,
doing like down tempo, kind of loungy, not really loungy stuff, but like my stuff was more like dub and jungle kind of stuff, but like coming from that kind of down tempo, chill out kind of vibe. And then went from that into like more breakbeat and ravey stuff in the late 90s, early 2000s. But yeah, I guess like somewhere in the mid 2010s, I started getting back into playing in bands and stuff, and was in like a synthwave band, Jaded Lover. And actually, at that point, like I tried my hand at like playing bass. Like I'd always like kind of fooled around with bass in my own music, but like became a bass player in like a synthwave band that had like 4 keyboardists, drummer, guitarist, and bass, 2 singers. That was pretty fun for a couple of years. But I, after that, like kind of fizzled out after 2 records. Some of the people in that band took it over as like a 2-piece like act that moved to like LA and Chicago. And I moved on to like just doing my own electronic stuff again, some dubstep, some jungle, some all kinds of stuff that like eventually maybe a couple of years ago I got kind of bored of like doing stuff that was too much in the realm of like traditional, well, not even traditional, but like classic dance music of whatever genre. And I came up with Love of Ruins to get back more to my roots of like rhythm and noise and more experimental stuff, and using like really just using found sounds and field recordings, chopping them up and making either really banging like stuff or really crunchy dark um soundscapes, that kind of thing.
okay.
uh
Can we go back to your tape loop time?
yeah,
'Cause
sure.
how old were you when you started doing tape loops?
I was literally like a teenager, like 14 or so. Um, I don't remember like exactly where I picked up like some of it. Maybe it was like William Burroughs cut ups and like Eno's experiments with tape loops and like some of the music concrete, like neoclassicist stuff, but like um yeah, yeah, it's so far back, in my memory now that like I don't know where I picked it up, but I was just like, oh, I can take this cassette tape, and if I just unspool it, and then like take a long strand of it and extend that from the shell of the cassette around something else, I can like get all these different links of like sounds of like loops. Before I got into like sampling and stuff like that, it was just like very manual process, that was fun. It was like at the same time I was also experimenting with like 60 millimeter film, and actually the first thing I got was an 8 millimeter like Super 8 camera, and developing like that stuff, and then like having these spools of film that I was like, well, I need to edit it by hand, like regular like splicer and Exacto, or razor blade and some tape. And it was just like such a fun, like hands-on way to do things. Like, that stuck with me like mentally for a while. But then like once I got a sampler, I was just like no turning back.
What were you playing those tapes on?
Literally like old school, like the cassette recorders, and just like running the spools out. Like also like I had one of those like Fostex, 4-track cassette, like studios things, Um,
Pre-Porta,
I I'm sorry.
the pre-Porta Studios, or maybe they were called Porta Studios back then.
Porta Studio, yeah, that's exactly what it was. Yeah, Tascam, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had one of those like probably when I was like 15, I guess. Yeah, like 85, 86, somewhere around there. Getting old here. dating myself, but
Just 10 years.
yeah.
So you were talking about how you don't like to limit yourself in terms of palette, and throughout your music making career, you've not limited yourself to palette, to one palette, but you have in this compilation. You're given, I think, 4 hours of pretty much pink noise is what cicadas make. I mean, you're given just their shrieking, and you managed to make something unlike all the other tracks on the compilation. Like by far, it's unique and it's awesome. I think it's a great way. It's the last track on the comp. I think it's a great way to wrap it up. But when you've worked with field recordings, and you talk about chopping them and turning them into things, did you see when you were given the cicada recordings that as a limitation? Or is it because you seem to have the sound design ability to take a limited palette and make it back to what you wanted in the first place?
Yeah. I mean, after years and years of like, working in like DAWs, and doing a lot of sound design, like I have also as well several years of like doing design for games and commercials and that kind of thing. And I'm a visual designer by trade as well during the day. So like I love like finding source materials and totally manipulating them with the tools at hand, shaping them into something else, like totally transforming things. With the Cicada, the Brood X compilation, and the challenge there to just use the Cicada samples, I was like, oh, this is a great challenge because I really want to flex like some of like my skills in sound design, and see how far I could push this away from the source material, right? Um, so normally, although these days I'm very much like hands off the computer, except for just like recording like stems like from my hardware and then later doing edits. With this, I was like, oh, I've got like all these hours of source material of the same thing, just the nuances of like the acoustics and how they were picked up and that kind of thing. But I was like, what if I, just bring them all into my DAW, into Ableton, and start looking for things that are like, they have like hard transients and like easy ways to find like, I wanted it like, knowing that it was going to be like a, a drone compilation. I was like, well, what if I like, start making drums out of like cicadas, like mechanizing them into like, robots, rhythmic robots or something like that. There's a mental image that I had in my head. It was like, all right. So I just went through every single one of the recordings and looked for like all those spikes, that had like enough like, of a range of sound in them that I could turn them into like a, kick drum or snare drum or hi-hat. And chopping them just down to that little bit, and then like processing the hell out of them, like compressors, gates, reverbs, a lot of EQ, in a chain. Each one had its own chain, but then putting them into a drum rack then, and then like putting like glue compressor on that to like kind of mesh them all together. It was a pretty like anal process, like this like spending hours like listening to like looking for that one little pop that would just be like and it really, you couldn't tell like by looking at the waves like where they were. I had to listen to it, like I could kind of get an indication where there were some spikes, but really like it was more like the fullness of the sound spectrum within like any one like moment that I was looking for, like a certain timbre. So that was kind of one of the things that I was challenged myself to do. But at the same time, I didn't want to completely break away from like doing drone, ambient type of stuff with it. I wanted to respect it enough that like there was some element of that in there. But I couldn't stop myself. So I laid down all these beds. I kept a couple of the beds in the recording in the background as just sort of, this is my atmosphere that I'm working within, and then I ended up putting this granulator like Max MSP like plugin that has a tendency to not just like granular synthesize like any snippet of sound that you give it, but it also can add a lot of color to it. So you can get anything from like bell tones, like detuned or like completely tuned into whatever key you want, to like some really weird, like, spatial, like warped out, like synth sounds, without like doing much to it. It's just like changing like frequencies in an, EQ, 8, or 16 band EQ, but then it automates them and then like plays with the granules of like, the whole thing. So I used that as like sort of base, and then I started adding, these little hits that I, made. And I thought like, maybe I'd go like crazy, like with the rhythm and like get all skittery, like, breakcore jungle or something with it. But I was like, nah, I'm going to keep it like pretty mechanical and like stripped down, and take it more from my like industrial techno roots, and like even further back to like, the stuff that was like when the Swans first started like bringing in like drum machine type of sounds, but like so much distortion and so much like compression that like doesn't sound like a drum machine, doesn't sound like a drummer. It's just like sounds like a machine, right? So yeah, it's kind of where I was going with it, was loosely this like making cicada mecca.
Well, that's like,
Um,
listening to your track. It's very clear that, yeah, like I could see like a video being like black and white factory, but it's just the cicada buckling its Tymbal, making the sound. He's like,
and then transforming into like super, all of them like swarming into like one area and like becoming super cicada brood-X,
yeah. Well, like, so yeah, it's very clear listening to your track that, I mean, or it's not very clear, but I think I know what was going on, is that you took like almost an individual, so the cicada makes its sound by basically buckling its ribs together. And it's like a drum hit, but it sounds like you were able to isolate one and then pitch it down for that kick. And
Yep.
I don't, because there in the recordings, there are a couple of, and big shout out to Noel Mueller from Grimoire Records. He did, I think, 3.5 hours of those recordings. And you could hear the individual cicada, and if you slowed it down, you could hear the like individual snaps. And I'm guessing that's what you were doing.
Yeah, that's totally where the transients were. But there was also some incidental sounds that might not have been, like, might have just been atmospheric things around in the environment. I mean, those were all really good and like clean recordings, as far as field recordings go. There weren't a lot of extraneous, like, random sounds, but I wasn't like always like, okay, this isn't a cicada, but it's in the recording. I took some liberties there. If it was just like something banging in the background, like I'd take that. And I stacked a few things too. Like, I mean, none of the drum sounds are any one individual sound. They're like, layers of things in the drum rack, that like fire off like as individual hits, and again have tons of effects on them, as well. Yeah.
So
I mean,
that's really cool. Like, yeah, in at least some of the recordings are bullfrogs and birds. I think there was
yeah. Oh yeah. Actually, there's in my track, there's something that like, it must be a bullfrog, because when I slowed it down, it was like it started sounding like laughter. And I think it was frogs like croaking like at the actual pitch that it's supposed to be at, natural frequency. But when I slowed it down, it was just like this really creepy kind of like laughing, and like I made that like part of like the whole like thing, like going throughout like every. It wasn't every 16 or so. Like I did use some, because I was using Ableton. I did a little bit of generative things, like, or at least operations that like would give a little bit of chance into like the report into the sequence, I guess, because it's not really like structured like song like ABC, with a chorus and all that. But the way that things change is really kind of just done by procedures of like, if then, like, next thing happens,
So are you using Max for that, or are you doing that?
There's an automation channel in any Ableton like audio track. You could basically set like this goes for 8, and then the next thing happens, and it'll go through the clips in that like track. So I had it like going like from 1 through 4, and then like jump to like 10, and then jump back, like slightly different order every time. So there's just a little tiny bit of like randomness in there, but not enough to actually notice it. It just gives it like, so hopefully it's not completely monotonous, although, some of the monotony is intentional or repetitiveness, I should say, not monotony.
Monotonous. It is repetitive, but I think that's really fits with the title you gave it too.
Yeah.
So moving off the compilation, your track there, can you talk a little bit about any projects you're working on right now, any collaborations or anything like that?
Well, due to COVID and stuff, I guess a lot of people are like doing online collaborations. And I mean, this is kind of the closest I've gotten to collaborating with people, is like just being involved in a compilation of using the same source material. I'd like to get back to collaborating with people like in person. I think I when I work with people in a collaborative sense, I tend to feed off the spontaneity of like being in person with them more than like trying to like just throw things over the wire, and like show me what you did last week, and I'll update it over here and throw it back and forth. Like, I don't know, that starts to like get a little less like interesting to me than like doing things in real time with other people. But eventually we'll get back to that. As far as like collaborations in the past, I mean, I've done a lot of that too. I don't know, sorry to be vague there, but so many projects. It's like I can't really like think of anything recently. No. In the future.
All right. Well, and so any current projects going on?
I'm working on another. Last year, at the beginning of the pandemic, I put out like my first like solo, album as myself, my own name.
I'll throw a link to that in the description, because that's a really great album, and I think people would love to hear it. But yeah,
thanks.
Sorry to interrupt, but yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm basically working on a follow up to that. I had most of it done like almost 6 months ago, and I had a hard drive crash and had to send it off for data recovery, and just got it back like last month. So I'm digging back to the files and getting it back to a place where I can send it off for mastering. Shouldn't be too long. So like the last one that I did is, my first Mike Reger project. This one will be kind of dark ambient with some like dark trip hop, a little bit trappy kind of beats, like 808, like big bass sounds, contemporary, sound design, but with a little twist, a little darker, than trap or trip hop or whatever you want to call it. My ambient stuff is definitely darker because I don't know. I like to make people uneasy with ambient music.
Now, when you say ambient, are you referring to ambient electronic music, or ambient in terms of like ambient drone?
I mean, I'm not sure I understand the distinction personally. Like, I mean, ambient, like, as in like very spatial and can be background, but the way I'm approaching it isn't so much like traditional like Brian Eno ambient. Like, it's listen, stuff that you listen actively to, and I try to make it a little weirder than like something you just kind of lull out to, chill out to.
I think the distinction is drums.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Like, I mean, my last solo album, it was about half and half. I mean, half of it was no drums at all. I mean, if there was any rhythm, it might have just been in like some arpeggio patterns and that kind of thing. But then also like half the tracks definitely had this distinct like 100 BPM. I think I was working at. No, actually, I was working slower than that. I was like 60 and 70 BPM. stuff, like down tempo kind of beats. Yeah, it feels a little faster when the hi-hats are doing those like triplets and stuff, but yeah. This one might be a little bit more grimy and industrial than the last one was, like trip hop and ambient. But there's still elements that'll carry over. And then yeah, I have like some other stuff that I'm working on that's like really like sugary pop electronic stuff. I don't know how to describe it other than like it's got steel drums in it and and happy vocals.
Oh,
I actually sing. I'm actually singing.
oh, very cool, man. That's really
Yeah.
that's I think that's probably the bravest thing to do musically, is to try to throw your own voice on there, and lyrics. I don't know how people do it.
Yeah, I mean it's a new challenge for me for sure. I've experimented with it in the past with some releases and stuff, but I've done it with like vocoder or just like tons of harmonizer or lots of effects. You know, I'm just like, oh, my voice is like too squeaky or too nasally or whatever. You know, I'm just like, yeah, not totally comfortable with my own voice, like hearing it recorded. But yeah, some of these tracks came out pretty cool, and I wanted to like release them for a summer release because they're very summery, like I said, kind of sugar coated pop electronic. But I mean, when I say that, I'll caveat it that it's like sort of in the realm of like, I don't know, James Blake or like the XX or something like that. You know, it's like still alternative. It's not like Justin Bieber or anything like that, but it's definitely like I was using more major scales. Not I love like my last album was almost entirely in like you know, D minor and like like I had to kind of break away from that for a few tracks. So this one release, whatever it ends up being called, um, is definitely a standout amongst things that I've done in the last like 10, 15 years. It'll I'm pretty sure I'll put it out under my own name though, because yeah, it fits tempo wise and just palette wise with a lot of the other stuff that I'm doing under my own name. But it's a departure for sure.
You mentioned that, and this might have been before we press record, that you know you do a lot of stuff under different monikers.
Yeah.
So you your own name, you've got Love of Ruins. What else?
Well, let's see. I mean, if I go back, there was Avatars of Dub was like the first like act with my friend Phil, that like in the 90s we got signed by Thievery Corporation, doing kind of down tempo stuff, not terribly dissimilar to what I'm doing now, but with a lot of like dub influence, obviously, and jungle, like halftime, double time kind of stuff. Like, but within that like Thievery Corporation kind of chill out lounge realm. Put out a couple records with them, and then after that, I started doing solo stuff as Reger, which is similar but a little bit more up tempo and a little less loungy or dubby, but more like funky and breaky and like, but with organic, like natural like instruments that, you know, I played guitar and bass and stuff on those as well as drums, and then sampled them, and then, you know, made them in these, you know, kind of mid-tempo dance floor type of things, like for early evenings at outdoor pool parties or whatever. And then like, you know, I did that for a couple of years, and then I was doing this other thing called microsound that was pretty straightforward, like the name sounds, like kind of glitchy, IDM-y, like super chopped up stuff. Is similar to the way I approached the Cicada Brood X project. That was like just finding artifacts of things and like really emphasizing little spikes and sounds and like dirt and grime and in the recordings, and like making music out of that, you know. And then a couple of years ago, I was in a live band playing bass and synths as Jaded Lover. It was like a 6-piece synthwave band, very like kind of 80s throwback, you know, feel to it. 4 people playing synths, the guitarist, bassist, me, and like drummer that had like synth drums as well as real drums. And, you know, played a bunch of shows live all around with that band for a while. it was really fun. I kind of miss playing in live bands, even though I kind of hate the egos, dealing with egos of other people, and not having all the control, having to give up the control is a little weird. But
It
yeah,
sounds like you're talking about your own ego there, where it's like
you got me.
I totally hear you on that. Being in bands,
Yeah,
but we're very rewarding.
I mean, I figure, now I'm getting old. Like maybe my ego will let go of that control a little bit if I ever get into that situation again. But yeah. So I did like Jaded Lover for a couple of years, like between 2013, 16, something like that. But at the same time, I was doing dubstep as Mikey Dubs, and then as like the dubstep scene and the global dance scene like started to wane and like become like super bro, I started moving away from that more into like techno again and like off kilter type of techno, not like straight 4/4 bangers or anything like traditional like weird polyrhythm stuff that had breakbeat influences but wasn't using breakbeats, and that sort of led into a desire to even get away from traditional dance music, electronic dance music. And I started doing the Love of Ruins project, which this is filed under, because I was like, I'm using my synths too tonally. I'm like, my drums are too predictable to me. Like at this point, like I just don't want to do what everybody else is doing. So I started doing more, getting back into like using field recordings and found sounds and chopping those up and getting more into rhythm and noise rather than like, dance songs, per se. Um, and I had like just a ton of field recordings of like going to India, like going to other countries, like traveling around, stuff that I recorded with a Zoom, and it's just like I need to do something with this. So it's been a project that's been ongoing for several years now. I think actually it was the the compilation that you put out like for Jeffrey Prosser, that like was like probably the first thing that like then came out under like Love of Ruins, and it pushed me to do a lot more of that kind of stuff. And then there was the Space Sounds like compilation, and I took a similar approach with that to what I did this time, where it was like, all right, I've got all these like awesome recordings that have been given to me that I have to only use those, but I want to do something completely different with them. So I applied the same sort of techniques with that one. And yeah, this is the follow up to that. I've got a bunch of tracks in between for this project moniker, but not sure what I'm going to do with it yet. Like, we'll see. Yeah, there's a lot of things on the horizon that kind of like, I got a mountain of like archive like material that I'm not sure what I'm going to do with next, other than my solo album that will probably come out before the end of the year.
So I'm going to give a little context. So the Jeffrey Prosser compilation, it's called Third.
Yeah, sorry.
And no worries. So Jeffrey was a friend of, he's literally probably a million friends. Super sweet guy. I think he's from Fredericksburg, Virginia, but he started playing music heavily in Richmond and in DC. And I had the fortune of being in one band, actually two bands with him. One we never actually did anything with. It had a great name though, Children. And so far,
nice. Yeah. That is so Jeffrey Prosser.
So I can't use it without him, but I am on that SoundCloud. But yeah, he awesome drummer, and he wrote a lot of electronic music. And his electronic music was just amazing. He played what was his band name? It's funny because he's on the compilation Caval. I think Caval. I don't know if you ever heard that.
Oh yeah, with the female singer. I forget her name, but yeah, it's a really beautiful stuff.
Yeah, they were an outstanding band, and I think I went to all but like one Caval show. And Ivan Kilko, who I'm going to interview later, was briefly in Caval as well. It was really cool.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he added a lot. he did a lot of like mixing and extra effects that really just kind of was the glue. It provided a level of connection that wasn't there. But Jeff was live. He'd play drums and do sort of the triggering of synths and stuff. And Meg would play some synths and sing as well.
Yeah.
Anyway, when Jeff passed away, we put together a compilation, and I think we had 22 artists on it. Jeff passed away on April 3rd, 2015, and he had I think he had a running show he called Thirsty and Miserable. And
yes.
so the compilation, which I think is a Coil song, I can't remember. But he then, so we then named the compilation after that. Or no, he always wanted to start a label called Thirsty and Miserable. And so we named the compilation after that. And Jeff was a graphic designer, and he had all these, he did really great work manipulating artwork that was basically in the public domain. And so he had uploaded it all to Flickr, the stuff that he was going to work with. So we used that for the cover art, and some of it he had already manipulated. So Jeff not only appears on the compilation with Caval, and the one in his honor, and also did like the cover art. So it's like really cool. And we managed to use the same fonts he used in most of his posters and stuff to really get the Jeff Prosser vibe. But yeah, so that was sort of how we met, through Jeff. And and then
it was.
The other compilation is let's see, it was a space compilation where we took NASA samples, radio transmissions that NASA had recorded. It was, and the title of it was, I think, I'm going to get this wrong, 6138, but Roman numerals 37.
Right.
I'm looking at it right now. I'm like, all right, yeah, 60, 61, 50, I don't know. No, 57, 37. Okay. When we put it out, it was 57 years after Yuri Gagarin had climbed into the Vostok 1. I'm definitely reading right now. And and then the first space shuttle trip, which was also on April 12th, but in 1981, 20 years after Yuri Gagarin's trip. And so we did a compilation that only used radio transmissions. And that, I think, was much harder than the Cicada one, because at least there were fewer samples. It was, I think, only 7 samples that total about 12 minutes, as opposed to 4 hours of basically the same sound, all of one sound. But yeah, I thought the NASA compilation was much more difficult. But
yeah, and the palette of that was also like all over the place. Like, I mean, those sounds are like totally different. Some like super, like the quality was like super lo-fi, and like, you know, like really tinny in the high end, and like no bottom end, and others are like super distorted. Like, you know, I mean, you know, they're old, you know, recordings like from space, you know, radio transmissions and shit, you know. That was a really interesting challenge too. And it was really fun to like try and, you know, come up with a process to work within that. Like I said, I ended up using in this one as well, and probably will for a while. Like I'm really digging like limiting myself to like, okay, just these sounds, and then apply this approach to it. You know, now that I have this technique that I feel like I've mastered. Yeah, but all those compilations are great. And being on the Jeffrey Prosser one was like super dear to me. Like, he's like, I went to college with him, and like roommate at one point. We played in a bunch of industrial bands, banging on like, you know, steel drums, and like using grinders, and like, you know, doing that old industrial kind of style of things back in the 80s. And then like we were next door neighbors in DC the entire time I lived in DC for like 10 years.
Did you live
and
in?
So
Were you in Mount?
I live. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, degrees of Zoom. Were you in Mount Pleasant?
Adams Morgan, the top of Adams Morgan, which is, yeah, basically, you know, Mount Pleasant, the Chalfont. Yeah, weird, creepy old building that like I got in with a girlfriend and like 95, broke up with her. It was her lease, but I never left. I stayed there till, I don't know, 2004 or so. But like the entire time, Jeffrey was right across the hall from me. So we were best buds like for better part of 30 years. Such a huge, like, inspirational character that guy was. You know, I miss him dearly.
I do too. One of my favorite things about Jeff and was his ability to be like, in the most positive way, like, hey, you've done that before, try something else. Like, don't be afraid of trying something new. And
yeah, he was really good at, like, you know, pushing like things. Like, I mean, he was we were in like in college, like in sculpture together. So like, I mean, I think he learned a lot about like critique from some of our professors, mutual professors, and he's really good at like positively pushing you without like being negative about it, and like, but also being a little. He had a wry sense of humor that, like, you know, I don't know, I don't know how to describe it, but you know.
yeah, very wry sense of humor. Yeah, I've got a lot of Jeff Prosser stories that I can't comfortably share.
Yeah, I'm sure. We used to do a performance art together where he'd try to convince me to hang me upside down and throw things at me, like, you know, fire, water, like, you know, powder, all kinds of stuff, like endurance tests and stuff. I was a guinea pig in like a lot of our like class performance art pieces.
We had this plan that unfortunately didn't come to fruition. And this was I don't know, probably 4 or 5 years before he passed away, but he was going to drum, and we are going to do like a synth project with heavily vocoded vocals, and so it was going to be a little referential to a lot of like Detroit roller rink music, but much faster. And I was going to be dressed as a robot, covered basically in MIDI pads, and he'd like get a beat going, and I'd walk over to him like a robot, and he would just like start hitting
Play
me.
you.
Yeah, I'd be like dancing, and he was hitting MIDI pads on me, and also I'd be singing, and I was like it was one of those ones I was like, I talked to some friends about it. I think this is like 2012, maybe, I'm not sure, and I convinced some friends that they wanted to be a part of this too, and they would be on stage dancing, and so like we had this whole production idea, but the big problem was we couldn't write any music. We came from such disparate backgrounds that we couldn't come up with the corny stuff we needed to accompany this weird robot thing we were going to do. We'd backstories like, yeah, like that Jeff had built me or something. I don't know. It was weird stuff.
Yeah, he loved like coming up with those sort of like, I don't want to say S&M, but there was some like, you know, control, like toying with people, like kind of things that he liked to do that was fun. It was never like, you know, really controlling or, you know, domineering or anything, but like he played with a lot of those kind of notions of, you know, control, submission, you know.
So the wry sense of humor thing, you just reminded me of something. There was a set he played at the Velvet Lounge. It was a Caval set, and this was he had played drums live and like triggering stuff off his computer and stuff. He had done all that, but this time he decided he was going to be standing and doing it. And so he brought a CD player on a rack mounted CD player. He had like mixers and effects and stuff, but all he really was doing was pressing play and then messing with the mixer a little bit. And I don't even know if it was routed through the mixer. And he was like, people love it. They think I'm like doing all this crazy stuff, but I just press play on CD. Normally he did like much more elaborate stuff.
Oh yeah. Yeah, nobody would question his you know, prowess as a musician, but yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised he would try to get away with something like that.
It was a great FU. It was like, yeah, look at me, I'm up here playing CDs. Hey, did you know? This is going a little off kilter. Did you know Mark Snyder from Richmond or you're not from Fredericksburg, right?
No, I was from Richmond, but then like moved all over the place all my like childhood, and then ended up back there for college, and that's when I met him.
Okay, because I met this guy Mark Snyder at there were 2 shows at least in honor of Jeff right after he died, and ironically he had helped set up both of them.
Wow.
Like he'd set up both shows, and they passed away, and they were like, well, these are just Jeff tribute shows, fuck it. But one of them, I met this guy, Mark Snyder, who was a professor at, I'm blanking on the college in Fredericksburg, but his stuff is absolutely beautiful. He's on the compilation for Jeff, and it's almost Cocteau Twins, Sigur Rós territory. It's really cool.
Nice.
But yeah,
I have to go back and listen to that.
Yeah.
I think I haven't listened to it in a while, but yeah, I mean, yeah, there's so much good music on there.
I think a big problem.
And
It's tough to listen to because it's like everybody wrote these tracks for Jeff.
yeah,
Like, everybody went out of their comfort zone to write these. So yeah, so it is tough. Actually, Chester Hawkins is on that, and TLO 741. They're both on the Cicada compilation. You're on it. Let's see. I think Ivan, Imminent Voiceless. He's half a Destroyer of Worlds. He's on it. So, hey, did you know Holmes Ives? Do you know
yeah, yeah. I know Holmes.
Okay.
He's an old friend, definitely.
Okay, cool. Because his stuff's really cool too. And
Yeah, yeah. He's a great producer, like super like dense productions, and like he's a master of like what he does. I did some artwork for some of his like releases back in the day. I haven't talked to him in a long time. Yeah, you just brought like back flood of memories. Now I'm thinking about
Sorry.
Holmes.
yeah, he's down. I think he's living in Mexico these days. I'm not sure. He just put out
Lucky.
something. But yeah, I think we should try to rope him in for the next compilation. I think he might have some fun with it.
Yeah. Great guy, man. I need to catch up with that guy again.
Hey, well, thanks for joining this evening. I'm going after we wrap up. Your track's gonna play, and yeah, thank you so much for being on the compilation. Your track is
Thanks for having me.
Oh man, it's a banger. It's so much fun to wrap up the compilation. Like it's a very dense compilation. Like so many people are within the strictures of drone and experimental music. There's so much variance, and it's cool or variation, and it's cool to have something. There are a few tracks that like there's a part in the middle of the compilation where things kind of go a little out there in terms of more abstract music, and comes back down in the drone ambient, and then I think Ivan's track is right before yours. Yeah, Imminent Voiceless. He's on the track, yeah, for sure, on the comp. But anyway, his is right before yours, and it's just like his track kind of has this fade out, and it's like time for the banger. Wrap it.
Nice. I'm glad I could be the exclamation point on the end there.
You totally are. Love of Ruins, Mike Reger. Thank you so much for joining, and yeah, man, have a great night.
You too. Cheers.
Cheers.